Check, 1 2 1 2 check.
Appreciate it, sir. Yeah, so why don't you go ahead, please.
Well, good morning, everyone. If you are looking for the framework of fostering higher education equity after the Supreme Court's SFFA ruling session, then you are in the right place. We'd like to welcome you this morning. We're going to jump directly into the conversation. We have plenty of spaces up front, so if you feel like you want to come a little closer, that's fine. If not, you are perfectly fine where you are. We will reserve some time at the end of the session for question and answer, so just look for the microphone as you have questions. We'll turn the floor over to our panelists. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Elston. Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good morning, good morning. I hope we are doing well. I hope we are having a fantastic time and enjoying CCA's annual convening so far. My name is Edward Smith. I'm a senior policy advisor at EducationCounsel, a mission-based education consulting practice based in Washington, D.C., and a proud board member of the Complete College America. I'm your moderator for a framework for fostering higher education equity after the Supreme Court's SFFA ruling. Of course, SFFA is short for Students for Fair Admissions, the organization that brought cases against Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, challenging the constitutionality of their ability to use race-conscious admissions, among many factors, to achieve the interests of educational diversity and enrollment. EducationCounsel has been doing a lot of work analyzing the ruling, trying to understand its scope, trying to understand its implications with partners in the room. Thank you, Campaign for College Opportunity and others. And we've learned that while there are different interpretations of the ruling, many higher education institutions are maybe shifting policies and redesigning programs and policies to fit a new legal environment for equity-based work, while trying to remain committed to the principles of diversity and equity, managing inclusion and belonging on campus, and sometimes under challenging political conditions as well. So rather than offer legal opinions or expert analysis here, what I'd like to do, keeping in the theme of CCA's convening, is to talk about how we as a field of institutional, state system leaders can move forward, building bolder, stronger commitments to higher education equity that sustain legal tests of the future, acknowledging new legal and political realities, but advancing the opportunities for equity that remain, particularly those at the state level. You won't just be hearing from me. I'm joined by two incredible higher education leaders steeped with education policy experience. They are well known in the CCA orbit and are dear colleagues and friends. Let me spend a couple of minutes introducing them so you know who they are. Brandy Johnson is the president of the Michigan College Association, Community College Association, excuse me. Prior to assuming this role in 2021, she served as Governor Gretchen Whitmer's education policy advisor and then as the manager of the Office of 60 by 30 within Michigan's Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. In 2010, she founded the Michigan College Access Network and served as its executive director through 2019, and before that was in Governor Jennifer Granholm's administration. Will Del Pilar serves as the Education Trust Senior Vice President. Prior to joining Ed Trust, Will served as Governor Tim Wolf's Deputy Secretary of Postsecondary and Higher Education, and before that in the Pennsylvania Department of Education working on the state's higher education initiatives. He also has campus leadership experience at Penn State University and the University of Florida, Chapman University, the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Loyola Marymount University. I struggle to think of two people more equipped to handle this conversation. Certainly there are plenty of leaders who have informed the landscape here, but I think we're truly blessed to have their expertise and experience shared here on the session, and I thank you all for being here with us. Just a few statements before we get started, and I'll speak for myself here, but I'm sure I speak for many of you all. As painful as the Supreme Court's ruling was to experience, to hear, to think about, to reflect and process, now is not the time for retrenchment, but rather the time for leadership. I'm inspired by the work that many of you all have done to organize, to think, to process, and to remain firm in your equity commitments under the assault of anti-equity movements in the states, and certainly the coordinated effort to undermine DEI initiatives on campus. I think the ruling undercuts the progress of many oppressed communities, students who have been disadvantaged, marginalized in higher education systems. And I hope that through that experience of processing and reflecting, we build a bolder and better landscape for higher education equity moving forward. So I draw hope and inspiration, even though I'm in pain and processing the ruling myself. You'll hear a lot in this session, but none of what you hear is legal advice. So it's important that I'll say that. This is a general discussion about policy opportunities. I'm not a lawyer. I don't believe we have lawyers up here, so please keep that in mind. Just a little bit of framing and background before we get started. I think many of you know, but I think it bears repeating. The ruling was a consolidated opinion that said that the admissions policies facilitated by Harvard and UNC violated non-discrimination law, namely the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, and moreover, violating that, violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which applies to public and private universities that receive federal funds. I think it also bears repeating that it was inconsistent with other rulings and mentioned that the court held neither Harvard nor UNC established compelling interest to justify the consideration of an applicant's racial status in admissions, and through this determination suggested that the programs lacked coherence and sufficiently focused measurable objectives, impermissibly employed race in a negative manner involving racial stereotyping, and lacked meaningful endpoints. But they left an opening, and I choose to try to break through this opening. I think this is the thing regarding racial equity in higher education, to further integrate discussions of race into the admissions process and otherwise, focusing more on the applicant's lived experience rather than the status that could be used as a preference in holistic admissions. Even with the ruling bounded around admissions, we understand that there may be interpretations that could implicate other areas of campus administration that use the same compelling interests to confer race-conscious benefits and opportunities. We've come to understand that when considering policy opportunities, there might be this gray area between what's prohibited and what's permissible. And in my work, in EducationCounsel's work, I'm sure many of you all have experienced this, there is a legal element that might frame one piece of a larger framework that many college leaders are using to evaluate policy opportunities moving forward. Notwithstanding, nothing in the court's decision should affect higher education's authentic commitment to educational diversity and the commitment we have to serving students of color and other marginalized students well. Many institutions are working on refining their policies in enrollment, management, and enhancing belonging and completion priorities. And I would suggest that, yes, we should be redesigning and perhaps shifting policies here. And even for those of us at the state level, yes, this might be where we turn to for the most immediate impacts and effects. But growing out, I think there's still opportunities, and maybe we want to scale up supports for belonging and completion. I won't go into discrete policies. I know many of them have been shared at this conference and discussed and evaluated in other sessions. But I think what I'm arguing here is that the states have a role, responsibility to understand what type of cross-cutting system-level strategies might promote educational equity and maybe be protected and even thrive under new legal environments in the future. And for that, I'm hoping that we'll lean on the expertise of our panelists to talk about how they interact with the new legal realities, political realities, and the experience they have to share, I hope, will help us think through a larger framework to make some of these decisions and explore some of these policies. This is not an exhaustive list, but I'm presenting a few for consideration, and I know we'll take up others in the discussion. Of note, I'll just spotlight the first four, since others have been discussed and evaluated in other sessions in meaningful ways, so I'll save that for another time. I think many of us understand that there's a real need to improve funding for colleges that serve as the backbones for post-secondary equity and opportunity. So I think full stop, moving on, I think we all understand that. But I think since the ruling, many of us have evaluated maybe better transfer and articulation as a potential response. But I'd love to know what that might mean for community colleges and how they might be implicated in the decision. And while many states have college promise programs or free college programs, and others have those plus direct admissions programs, do they need to be reevaluated and assessed in light of the legal ruling to eliminate restrictions and ensure that they generate the intended changes in enrollment and promote stronger completion outcomes equitably across the landscape? And certainly, there's the Complete College America's momentum policies that I think will rise to the fore of policy discussions, certainly on campus, but perhaps in systems in the states. So with that, let me stop, and I'll turn the conversation over to our panel. I'll join them here, and we'll get started with Will. As you know, Complete College America has championed many of these policy reforms and more. and with a focus on greater fairness and equity in our systems and structures. I've been in meetings, you've been in meetings, I know and have heard kind of these recommendations proposed as a response to the SFFA ruling. We've read reports about how they can be implemented in sustained legal tests. Similarly, I know you and folks at EdTrust have been at the forefront of galvanizing the advocacy community nationally and in states. What are the ingredients of an equity-centered policy framework for states? And what are your responses to some of these policies?
Yeah, I think when we're thinking about what was happening nationally, we have to realize that affirmative action really wasn't working. Most institutions were not using race as a factor in admissions anyway. Most institutions admit over 50% of the students, 50% of the students that apply. And so in reality, we were not doing a very good job in terms of attracting and enrolling a diverse set of students at institutions. So we have to acknowledge that what we were doing wasn't working. We needed a shift, and sometimes you got to get pushed into a shift. And I think we need to be thinking about what does it look like to create a pathway for universal access, right? And I think that there are ingredients at a state level that can be or steps that can be taken at a state level that can create a path towards universal access, right? I've heard folks say nationally that it's college for all, and everyone's thinking about is college, and the reality is that's not true. When you look at the data, 48% of students who graduated high school last year did not go on to post-secondary, didn't go on to college. That's half of students, right? That's half of students nationally who are choosing not to enroll in college, when we know that 70% of jobs nationally are going to require some type of post-secondary certification. So what we were doing wasn't working. Everyone isn't going on to post-secondary. Those that are going, only, conservatively, 60% finish. So there was a lot of work for us to do when we think about state policy frameworks. So I do think we need to really think about what intentional pathways through both community college and high school look like into post-secondary, right? And so I do think there are states that are doing really good jobs of creating intentional pathways. Delaware comes to mind, where they have a statewide system. I don't know if there's anyone here from Delaware, but they have a statewide pathways model that is the same at every high school. So if you want to do, for example, an education pathway, that exists in every high school in the state. Students get an experience every year in terms of what they're exposed to in terms of education. It's not just teaching. They expose kids to educational counseling, educational psychology. And so they create these intentional pathways that provide a roadmap for students, not only through high school, but into post-secondary. I think that we need to be investing in dual enrollment. I know most recently I looked at the National Student Clearinghouse data, and the number of students who are under the age of 17 in post-secondary is the highest growing group, and it's because of dual enrollment. When we look at the research in dual enrollment, we know that students who take dual enrollment classes are more likely to go on to post-secondary, they're more likely to graduate on time, they're more, especially if you expose students of color and first-generation students to those courses. So I think we need to be investing and thinking about dual enrollment. We need to really, you mentioned direct admissions, but we see folks doing this. If you tell every student when they graduate high school that they're admitted, and I think you could do this at the transfer level as well, if you tell them that they're admitted to a post-secondary institution like they do in Idaho, where every student gets at least 6 offers, including community colleges, and then I think students have to opt out of higher education instead of having to jump through all the hoops of opting in. You have to do direct admissions, right? So you can't charge a fee for every campus. You shouldn't be requiring students to jump through the hoops of the application and jump through the hoop of writing the essay. They leverage in Idaho, they leverage a state longitudinal data system. They know all the courses students took. They know what grades they had. They know how they did on state level assessments. And so they use that data to admit students. SUNY just did this as well. Every high school graduate in New York will also get an offer of admissions from the SUNY system. We see it in the Dakota, I think it's South Dakota, as well has leveraged direct admissions. So we see more people moving to automatically admit students so that they opt out instead of having to opt in. If you're going to do direct admissions, you also should probably do FAFSA as a high school graduation requirement. But FAFSA as a high school graduation requirement with support. So you cannot do it and say, this is now a requirement for graduation, go finish the FAFSA. We know there is some problems with the FAFSA right now. It won't even be released to December 31st. Campuses won't start getting information on students till the end of January. And so we know that I believe awarding is going to be significantly delayed this year for new and for returning students. So FAFSA as a high school graduation requirement with supports is another thing that I think from a state policy perspective should be explored. And you mentioned statewide free college programs, but I think if you remove the application, if you remove tuition as an expense for students to enroll in post-secondary, you've removed two of the biggest barriers that students face in terms of getting into higher education. We're making students perform, right, do all of this performative work to get into higher education when we have the data, when most institutions admit the vast majority of students that apply anyway. And so we should be removing barriers and creating these pathways when we think about enrolling in higher education. So I think statewide free college programs have promise. They have to be designed right. It can't just be for 2-year institutions. It should be both for 2- and 4-year institutions so that students have more options. And so those are some of the things, the ingredients, I think. I'll say data is important, so having a strong statewide longitudinal data system is important in order to be able to do this. And so I do think that that's another component when we think about what it looks like to create a framework for universal access. But I think there are states, and many of the states in the room probably already have some of these components. The question is, can you get the others to get over the finish line to create this universal access?
Sure, I appreciate that. Your comment and my paraphrase, affirmative action as a crutch, resonates deeply with me. I agree, but thinking of it in a larger context of the coordinated political and legal effort to undercut equity in higher education, I think it may have some profound signaling and material effects. Appreciate that. And that brings me to Randy here. I'll just remind the audience, Michigan banned race-conscious admissions many, many years ago. But that said, Brandy, drawing on your leadership experience, notably your work on several high-profile education attainment, economic opportunity initiatives, what lessons can you share with other states who may be grappling with this potentially new reality of a legal environment that maybe limits the things that they can do and the tools in the toolbox to promote equity?
Yeah, sure. So as Ed mentioned, this has not been a tool in our toolbox in Michigan for a very long time. Our Constitution disallows race-based admissions and sort of resource allocation. And so we've never had that tool in our toolbox, but yet have been able to really move the ball forward on a number of fronts. Like Ed said in my bio, I've worn these 3 very distinct but related hats. I have spent most of my career as the executive director of the Michigan College Access Network, a mission-driven 501c3 advocacy-oriented organization focused on policy that is student-centric. And then I spent on the bookends of that was the governor's education policy advisor for Governor Granholm and Governor Whitmer, and now I am the president of the Association of Community Colleges representing both presidents and trustees. But there's certainly been a common thread to all of those, related to student success, which I think is in my DNA. I'm a very proud first-generation college-going student. I think really the lessons I would say to other state leaders and policymakers is there are a lot of tools in the toolbox, and there's a lot of ways to get creative, particularly if you have some bold leadership in your state. Certainly Governor Whitmer has really, I think for the first time in Michigan, really highlighted this imperative of post-secondary educational attainment is key to prosperity at the individual level. In 2019, I had volunteered on her transition team and sort of helped prep for her first budget, her first State of the State address. And in her first State of the State address, she said, I'm setting our first state attainment goal, 60 by 30, and I also want to push forward a proposal called Michigan Reconnect to make community college tuition free for adults. In 2019 and 2020 and 2021 and 22, we had divided government with a Republican-controlled legislature and this new Democratic governor with a pretty strong mandate in a very purple state. We worked like hell in 2019 to get the votes for Michigan Reconnect. And just as we got those votes and they passed, it was March 12th. And obviously everything came to a standstill in our state, and the governor, who had worked really hard with this Republican legislature to get funding for Michigan Reconnect, painstakingly, and I was in pain when she did it, line item vetoed her own funding for her own signature program because we didn't know what the impact of the pandemic would be on our state revenues. So in March, sort of our lives changed, obviously went all in on just working on pandemic-related issues. I was the governor's liaison to colleges and universities, as well as K-12 school districts. And there's this moment, and I think this sort of illustrates the when you have sort of boldness and creativity, it can make real magic. I'm in my basement working 19 hours a day, 7 days a week for the governor, turning out executive orders. And this TV is on mute, but it's on CNN, and they're showing these just awful scenes of COVID wards in New York City. And I'm watching it, and the camera's sort of always on like the doctors and nurses running back and forth in the rooms. You see a patient, it's very sad. But then like just behind those people, there was like a man, black man pushing a mop in that hospital. And behind him was like someone at the little registration desk that was a Latina woman. And I remember thinking, oh my God, these same people are putting their lives on the line. They definitely don't have college degrees, and they're probably making $12 an hour. And it just like really shook me to my core. And so the day before, the state or the government had announced this GEAR funding, the governor's education emergency relief funding, which was just like a very flexible tranche of money. So I like put pen to paper. I wrote this 2-page memo about how we should be giving them college scholarships. And I'll never forget, I took it and I likened it to the GI Bill. So I called it the GI Bill for Essential Workers, was the name of this program that I created. And I took it to the governor on a Saturday morning, and I said, I think this is how we should spend our GEAR funds. And I explained the rationale and how too often people of color are in these service industry jobs that are front-facing essential work while we all have the privilege of working from home. She was like, I love it, let's do it. I hate your name. Let's call it Futures for Frontliners. Let's announce it at a press conference on Tuesday. And we did. And so within a couple of, we announced it, we launched it. Within like the first day of the application, we had 10,000 applicants. By the end, we had, we opened it up for a very short period of time. We had over 100,000 frontliners. And then when we looked back at the demographic data of who applied for Futures for Frontliners, the most overrepresented demographic was Black women.
I remember.
And it was, and like, it obviously is a place of equity, but for us, it was also a place of gratitude, saying thank you to these individuals that, kept our society running while we were able to stay safe at home. The good news is that revenues were justified, and the governor signed the budget a couple of months later with money for Reconnect. So now Futures for Frontliners got a head start to tuition-free pathway, but within a year, now all Michiganders 25 and older have a tuition-free pathway to community college. And then just this last year, we had a huge victory, and we got the state to lower that age to 21.
Incredible. Why don't we give it up for Brandy a bit more? I think you shared exactly what I would hope that we all take from this session. I hear many things there. Stood tall at a time of crisis and duress. The leadership you shared, creativity, and the ability to pivot, obviously with a supportive governor and an administration. But that said, I think that there are many things to take away from that anecdote, and thank you for that. I remember being at Kresge, gladly supporting that program. Not knowing the first name, I would have changed that as well.
Yeah, it was bad.
Yeah,
Marketing
it
was
awesome.
Not what I went to school
for.
for.
The program was awesome. Let me stay with you here. And I think this question is related. As I mentioned in the framing, many of us have seen a lot more interest in strengthening transfer from 2- to 4-year colleges as a response to the SFFA ruling, for many reasons I won't get into, but that has come to the fore. What does the ecosystem need to know about partnerships and transfer, particularly from community colleges, especially since this idea has been propagated as a potential creative response, quote
Yeah.
unquote, to the ruling.
So for us in Michigan, this is both like a bright spot, but also like a frustration that we aren't farther. So in Michigan, we have by far the most decentralized higher education ecosystem in the country. We have 15 public universities that are autonomous from each other and from the state, 28 community colleges and 3 tribal colleges, autonomous from each other and from the state, and about 25 or 26 not-for-profit private liberal arts colleges. And so transfer, to some degree is a kind of a nightmare in Michigan because it's all these one-on-one articulation agreements. Until about 10 years ago, with support from the Kresge Foundation and others, we made a real concerted efforts to build out statewide transfer pathways. We've done it with 10 majors. We were joking, we went to Louisiana session yesterday, and they've done it with so many more majors, and we're like, oh, so jealous, but it's really powerful. And then the data is showing it. We are now a top 10 state in terms of transfer outcomes. For students that start at community college, transfer to a 4-year, we're a top 10 state for successful outcomes. Now more than 50%, it's 52% of all graduates of 4-year institutions in Michigan have credit from a community college. We're incredibly proud of that. So all that being said, I think it does make a ton of sense as a way to develop more equitable outcomes, but I really think about it from the perspective of the workforce that we want to see. And by building these pathways into these 4-year majors, those professions will have the diversity that really reflects the demographics of our state. My new soapbox issue that I am going to be working on in Michigan, come hell or high water, is related to teacher prep education pathways. We do not have a teacher prep pathway for 2-year to 4-year, and if you were to map it out in a course sequence, it's nearly impossible to start at a community college, get an associate degree in general studies, and then transfer into a teacher prep program and complete 60 credits or be able to complete within 2 years, which is a travesty because it's one of the least diverse professions out there and the one that really needs to be the most diverse and to look like the faces of our students that we have in Michigan. It's predominantly white women, and it's really hard to change that without having community colleges play a larger role. In Michigan, we're also experiencing just really significant demographic shifts. So I sadly do think that part of the reason is this competitive nature between 2- and 4-year institutions, particularly among our public universities. It's a sort of natural disincentive because they want to, they see us as a competitor and not a pipeline. So that's something that we want to change. And then I'll just say actually one thing based on what Will said around direct admissions. I think that's exactly right, and I think that is something that we should be doing. Just a couple months ago, 10 of our regional universities announced direct admission to any student in high school that graduates with a 3.0. These are, to your point, universities that generally accept almost all students, well over 90% in every case, which I thought was great. But the first thing I did was call my counterpart for the 4 years and said, this is really great work, congratulations. I'm assuming those 10 universities will also extend that offer to transfer students that complete an associate degree with a 3.0. And they said no. And it was like a real blow, and I felt offended for my students, for the students of Michigan's community colleges. So that's another thing that I would implore states to think about in terms of these K-12 direct admissions is utilize community colleges.
Can I add,
Please.
when we think about the pathways, and there's something I know that Complete College America supports, is if you're gonna create pathways, then you have to do co-requisite remediation. Like, we shouldn't be putting students in 3 to 5 remedial courses. We know what the research says. The more courses you have, the less likely you are to graduate. So I would argue that, create the pathways, but also implement co-rec models. And then the other thing I would say is tuition, if you create a tuition-free program, that's great, but that doesn't solve all students' basic needs. And so I think it's Massachusetts that they decided that every community college program was a workforce program, which makes every student eligible for SNAP. If they're eligible for SNAP, they can actually get SNAP benefits. So I would say, like, it's very arbitrary what programs that states decide. They look at zip codes and they make decisions around which programs qualify or are workforce programs. Massachusetts said all of them are. And so I think that we need to be looking at students' basic needs beyond just the pathways, because we know that students are struggling with issues of housing insecurity, of food insecurity, mental health, and we need to be addressing those issues as well.
Amen on co-rec, and also just another example of creativity and policy design. And I was wearing my governor's office hat, not my association hat, but we kind of sneakily wrote into the Reconnect statute that the only institutions that were eligible to participate in Reconnect were institutions that offered only co-requisite to adult learners. And so it would have been real embarrassing for a community college to say, oh, we insist on doing traditional developmental education, standalone, and so therefore no one in our community will have access to free community college. No one was obviously willing to say that. And so within a year, we accelerated our efforts so that all colleges now exclusively offer co-rec for their adult learners.
Appreciate that. I have plenty of questions still on the list, but this might be my last before I turn it over to the audience for any questions or feedback, comments perhaps. But Will, you brought up data and research earlier, and knowing that obviously you have tremendous research chops and are thinking about the future of higher education research, how has the SFFA decisions influenced the questions, needs, maybe projects that you've been working on with colleagues? And how would you describe the post-decision horizon for education research?
I think we really need to be monitoring our data nationally. When we look at what happened in states, specifically like California, like Michigan, states that banned affirmative action, we saw a couple things happen. Number one, black student enrollment went down. And I just looked at data from California since 2003 up until last fall, and black student enrollment never recovered, right? It's down at every single Cal State University, at every single CSU, and every single University of California campus. As campuses got more selective, they admitted and enrolled less black students. And so they can talk about broader diversity, and I'm supportive of all types of diversity, but the percentage of black students in California didn't decrease. The institutions just weren't enrolling them. And so we need to continue to monitor our data and to look at inequities that occur at public institutions, because those institutions are funded by public dollars. And last I checked, black residents, Latino residents pay taxes too, so they should have access to those institutions. So one, I would say we should look at our data. Number two, one of the other things that we saw is that enrollments at for-profit institutions increased significantly in states that implemented affirmative action bans. And so I would closely monitor our for-profit that we know charge more. They tend to not provide the same benefits as a traditional college program, and so they saw enrollments, especially of students of color, increase. And then one of the things that was a bit surprising that we saw in some of the data was that students of color enrollment in STEM programs decreased. And so I would say, if we're thinking about teacher diversity, if we're thinking about diversity in STEM, those are a lot of times the best paying programs. We really need to be looking at enrollments and creating pathways and programs into those types of programs that are intentional and designed to benefit students. And so I'd say we need to, one, we need to pay attention to our data. Two, we need to be thinking about what areas are impacted as states and institutions implement this very, very differently. I was just on a call with a colleague this morning in Texas, and he's at the UT system, just implemented the DEI ban, and they're implementing it very different than Texas A&M, and I would say that we're gonna see the very same thing around the affirmative action decision. We've already seen it. The term is called repressive legalism. Folks get very conservative and then pull back. They say we can't do anything out of fear of getting sued. And so I would say, we're going to see very different implementation of this from institution to institution. We've seen Missouri already say that you can't offer financial aid, any targeted financial aid. That was not in the decision.
Or race-conscious financial aid.
That's right. Yeah, that was not in the decision. We saw that in Illinois as well. And so I would say, monitor the data and look for the number one bright spots, but also look at those institutions that aren't doing as well and have taken a significant turn. And as an organization that does celebrating and shaming of institutions. As advocates, and the advocates who are in the audience, don't be afraid to shame an institution for doing things that I would say, they are not within the scope of the law.
Appreciate that. I know we have a mic in the audience in case folks have questions, and I know we have one up here, so why don't we start? And maybe, right here. Thank you.
You can ask it.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead
we'll
and just
repeat
shout
it.
it in. Yeah.
I'll use my teacher voice.
Please.
Because I have one. My name is White Initiative in Tennessee, and so as the self-proclaimed cheerleader for HBCUs in the state, I'm curious on your thoughts about how HBCUs fit into this framework, and just offer agencies as a solution. So to your point about the decrease Black students in STEM in these programs that we know have a high return on investment, HBCUs are still overproducing. 1 in 3 Black scientists graduate from an HBCU. And so I would love to hear from you and where you're sitting. Michigan doesn't have HBCUs, but maybe how HBCUs fit into the framework, and as institutions, to your earlier point, that are open anyway, what does it like, and how do HBCUs answer the call?
I mean, I think HBCUs have a very important role to play. The reality is, though, there's a lot of states that don't have an HBCU. And so I do think that when we look at where students enroll in college post-high school, most students go to college within 40 miles of their home. And so for many students, an HBCU will not be an option. We have pushed, for example, like when we think about the framework to create free college nationally, it was the federal-state partnership, which would have made college free, tuition free, to include HBCUs in that framework, so that private HBCUs were also included in the free tuition model. So I do think that in any type of free college program, if a state has an HBCU should be an option for that free college model, even if it's a private HBCU. Because I do think that I think there's hope that HBCU enrollments will increase significantly as a result of this decision, which with Black students opting to enroll at HBCUs instead of at their predominantly white institutions. We saw some of this after the murder of George Floyd. I know that enrollment at HBCUs increased significantly, but we don't know if this is going to happen as a result, if that's going to happen as a result of this decision. I know that institutions are planning on significant increases, but the reality is we continue to under-resource HBCUs and MSIs generally, and community colleges for that matter. And I do think that an influx of resources at the federal level is not likely with the mixed Congress. So I do think states will need to step up in terms of supporting HBCUs if there is a significant increase in enrollment at institutions as a result of students deciding to go where they feel supported and where they feel wanted instead of enrolling at institutions where they may face significant negative campus racial climate. Our great answer, sorry.
Great session today. My name is Tina Gridiron, and I serve as Senior Vice President for ACT's Center for Equity and Learning. We often know that institutional leaders sometimes work independently and in isolation, and when we talk about bold change, my sense is that a collaboration of institutional leaders or institutions coming together with a similar approach that might spark a legal challenge so that we can arrest the ambiguous space that we're in, where each campus is making unique minor adjustments that then causes a lot of challenge for our first generation students of color to navigate. What has been your experience, or what are you seeing out there around coalitions of leaders, coalitions of institutions preparing themselves to challenge the ambiguous space with a very declarative approach to this ambiguous, the center circle that you provided in one of your first slides? Are you seeing any movement around collaborations among institutional leaders to engage rather than being passive, waiting for the challenge?
I mean, Ed has been a part of lots of these.
Sure, I'll just say quickly, I through my post at EducationCounsel, I've been working with a number of membership associations to do more clustered restructuring, clustered positioning, and maybe try to harness a greater sense of and cohesion around the interpretations that would lead them to making the commitments, voicing them, adjusting appropriately so that the public and their stakeholders know that they're committed to equity, but not only just know it through the communication, but see it in practice, see it in policy. So I would say that membership associations, intermediaries, clusters of institutions have been maybe a kind of the scope of kind of coverage that we've been working with to get to that point where you're not seeing these changes in isolations that could be complex to navigate if you're a parent or student, but rather that you have a sector or cluster of institutions that are standing firm on this commitment, and you can see it in the policies and practices that they employ. I would also say I'd call on funders, a former program officer at the Kresge Foundation. I know you know the funder landscape well. I think pooled resources to protect institutional leaders who voice their commitments to equity, who want to stand firm in a legal interpretation that would suggest that their policies, many of them we've discussed and perhaps more, are legally safe and sustainable, right? And that they're going to plant the flag based on evidence, based on what they know in their context and in their community, that this is right, just, and what they should be doing to serve campuses and communities. I think funder organizations, the private sector, business community can offer not only financial resources, but champion these institutions that hold firm on these commitments, and perhaps even advance litigation in cases that I think help us go on the offensive instead of being reactive to some of these rulings and decisions.
I do wonder if we, go ahead.
Oh, just one quick tip. I shared this at the president's meeting yesterday, but Google Mike Gavin, Delta College Education for All. And if you're a president, you should get on his group. And if you are not a president, you should tell your president to get on his group. It's sort of formed organically. Really proud of Mike Gavin. He's one of my members. He's the president of Delta College in the Midland Bay City, Saginaw area of Michigan. And his academic background is in white nationalism, and he has pulled together this safe space for presidents to talk to one another about these really difficult issues that are happening in states in a way that is protects those that need to be protected. So I would highly, highly, highly encourage you to shoot him an email and ask to be added to the Education for All. It's presidents only.
I think this will be our last question here, but go ahead.
Gotcha. We have one last question.
Hi, thank you all for your engaging presentation. My name is Allison Handy, and I'm Assistant Vice President at the institution I work at. And, thinking about the decision in regards to race-sensitive admissions, for me, one of the things I now think about is what's next. What potentially will be another issue when it comes to race sensitivity and equity in college admissions and students completing college. And you all brought it up, I can't remember exactly who it was, but you talked about race in context of financial aid. And as I think about that, I think about how do we get out in front of something like that now? What do you see are potential issues that will come about in regards to race and financial aid? And as we recognize, there's been a lot of funding that has come about that specifically targets or that specifically works to assist students of color. And what do we need to be thinking about going forward, and how do we get out in front of the issue of potential race-sensitive financial aid issues going forward?
I mean, I would say it's easy for me to answer this question sitting here, but I would say don't be afraid to get sued, but I know everyone's afraid to get sued. But I do think that there's a real threat. In fact, SFFA sent over 100 college letters saying that the decision extended into financial aid. And so they reached out directly to institutions. And I don't think the battle over specifically one, financial aid is over. I do think that, we see it happening in Texas right now, and I think that's the next, Texas and Florida. I think it was like 38 states introduced anti-DEI bills.
Yep.
What that meant in Texas currently, and like I said, I was just on a conversation, was that they are having to change programs that were focused on, for example, recruiting students of color to make them focus on low income. And we know that, a program that's race neutral is inherently not race neutral. It's benefiting someone, it's just not benefiting the students who you're trying to get to your campus. And so, I would say that, we need to be watching what's happening in Texas. They're monitoring the data, they're looking at their data to see, number one, what goes away as a result of some of the bills that have been passed at a statewide level. But I do think that, the very next attack is probably likely financial aid, and then I think that we'll look at these affinity groups and groups that are, focused on college campuses, like, minorities, fraternities and sororities, programs. I think that, we need to be thinking about if they're going to be attacks on if not the campus racial centers, like, Black Student Union, Student Union for Students of Color. I think those are all things that are going to be part of this playbook.
I'll just say in closing, I think the financial aid issue is a now issue, and I think we're currently battling it out. And the next horizon I would suggest are quote-unquote race-neutral policies, and you could think of test-free or test-optional policies. If they are employed in a response to this, who do they advantage, who is disadvantaged? And I think they'll be in the mix for this kind of anti-equity movement that we're now seeing here. So I would say that's a helpful place to start if you are thinking of next-gen issues.
Can I say one thing? I think we need to be looking at the workforce space. Governor Whitmer, Governor Newsom, others removed requirements of a bachelor's degree and are doing skills-based hiring. I'm starting to think about what does skills-based admissions look like? To move away from some of the markers that we look at traditionally in higher ed. Are there different things we should be looking at? Appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you can please give our panelists a round of applause.
I was like clapping for myself.
So please follow the schedule for what's next on the agenda. Just a quick logistical note. One of the things that we continue to ask is we want to get feedback from these sessions. So if you get a moment before you walk out the room and just go onto your app and click on the session, we'd love to hear just a quick little bit of feedback. We have a very short survey for every one of our sessions. So thank you, panelists, again. Thank you very much for attending.